I want to begin certainly acknowledging the thousands of people who are outside protesting, many of whom are from the state of Wisconsin. Many more lately have been coming in from other parts across the country. Certainly acknowledge their right to be heard. But I particularly want to thank the 300,000 plus state and local workers from across Wisconsin who, unlike those here today, didn't skip out on work, showed up for their jobs, did their jobs the way that they have done in the past, and I believe will do in the future. And that is good, be good professional public servants, and we appreciate the work that they continue to do. Certainly, again, as I mentioned, the folks outside have every right to be heard. But there's 5.5 million people in this state, and certainly the taxpayers of this state have every right to be heard. We're not going to allow for 1 minute the protesters to feel like they can drown out the voices of those millions of taxpayers all across the state of Wisconsin. What we're asking for today, and what we continue to be pushing for in this Capitol, is bold when it comes to politics. It's a bold political move, but anytime you challenge the status quo, it's going to be bold. But it is a very modest request of our government workers all across the state. When I was traveling around the state, it's something worth repeating because we've been hearing it time and time again from people contacting us. When I was out at manufacturing plants talking to blue-collar workers across the state earlier this week, it reinforced to me that in many of those cases, they're paying anywhere from 25 to 50% of their health care costs. Most of them don't have pensions, and those that have 401ks, many of them have seen that the contributions from their employer has been suspended in the last year or two, I should say, as the economy has made it difficult in order to preserve jobs. And that is in contrast to the very modest request we're asking for, which is a 5.8% contribution to the pension system and a 12.6% contribution from state workers for their health care premium. That's half the national average. The workers I talk to around the state continue to hear from even today. They think that's a deal they'd love to have. I know when I talk to others in my family, they point out my brother, who's in many ways a typical middle-class family. He and his wife both work. They have 2 kids. And for them, they're paying almost $800 a month for their health care and for the money they set aside in their 401k. What we're asking for is a reasonable piece of balancing this budget. Wisconsin has a $3.6 billion deficit that we face going into the next biennium. We're broke. Like nearly every state across the country, we don't have any more money. We've been broke for years. In fact, 2 years ago, they kind of delayed the pain by taking $2.2 billion of stimulus money, and instead of using that for one-time costs like infrastructure, the previous governor and legislature used that to plug in a $2.2 billion hole in terms of the Medicaid and school aid deficit. That's part of the reason why we're here today. They failed to make the tough decisions 2 years ago. We're making the tough decisions now, not only to balance our budget and help our local governments balance their budget, but to make sure 2, 4, 6, 8 years down the road, our kids and our kids' aren't having to deal with these same crises. So we're here today because we were elected to make tough decisions. I was elected, I interviewed for this job over the last 2 years and told the voters what I would do to get Wisconsin working again, to show that Wisconsin was open for business. We made bold changes in the first month in terms of turning the business climate around to make it easier for private sector employers to put more people to work by easing the burden of taxes, litigation, regulation, and the cost of health care. Now, the next great quest for us to get Wisconsin working again is to balance our budget and to do it in a way that is prudent for the future, not only for the state, but ultimately so that local governments can have those same tools. And that's really what's at the heart of what we're talking about today. I've heard, and I want to clarify some facts, I've now heard after several days in that some union leaders at the state level, the same unions who tried to cram through a series of employee contracts in December, who had, after the election, before I was sworn in, who had no interest in talking to us then about negotiating, but wanted to get that pushed through while they still had the previous majorities in place. Unfortunately for the taxpayers of the state, they failed to do so. Now suddenly they're talking about being interested in negotiating. Again, we don't have any money. We can't make a good faith effort to negotiate when we don't have any money. But more important than the fact that at the state level, in the past decade, the average amount of time for a contract negotiation has taken 15 months. The reality here beyond that is for our local governments. And I used to be a local county executive. For our local governments, I know this well firsthand. We can't expect for our 72 counties, for 424 school districts and for more than 1,000 municipal governments across the state of Wisconsin. But somehow magically, because a few people are suggesting they might be willing to come to the table now, that we can ensure that every district and every jurisdiction is able to achieve these savings just because a few people are now at the 11th hour claiming they want to negotiate. The bottom line is to ensure what's going to happen in a week when we introduce our budget. There are going to be reductions of significant size when it comes to aid to local governments in the state, just like nearly every other state across the country. But unlike New York and California, for example, they cut billions of dollars in their proposals from their schools, their university system, and ultimately from their local government without giving them any tools to balance it off. In this bill, we're giving them the tools to ensure that they don't have to incur massive layoffs and they don't have to cut core programs at the state and school district level. That's what this is all about. To protect our schools, to protect our local governments, we need to give them the tools that they have been asking for, not just for years, but for decades in this capital. And once and for all, when this measure passes, that's exactly what they're going to get. Now, one other thing that's interesting is it seems as more national and political figures come into this capital, the facts seem to be straying further and further away from the truth because we've heard some pretty big doozies today. The reality is that we do have a financial crisis in this state. We do even in this current year. The reality is that because of the way the previous governor and legislature budgeted, we have a shortfall when it comes to Medicaid. We have a gap when it comes to the correction system. We have a gap when it comes to public defender. In addition, we owe nearly $60 million to the state of Minnesota because of a failed payment from the previous governor for tax reciprocity. We have bill collectors waiting for us to collect bills and finally step up and take care of the bills that we owe. And the fact that the bills will be forthcoming even more so in the future. We're going to do what it takes to get this budget on track. And equally, if not a greater importance, we're going to make sure that we're set up come July 1st when the next biennial budget begins, that we have the tools not only to balance the state budget, but to ensure that all of our local governments have the tools they need to balance their budgets with these very modest proposals to allow all of us, myself included, my cabinet, the legislature, to help make more in terms of pension and premium, healthcare premium contribution. So that's kind of where we're at. I know there's a bunch of questions. We'll take a few before you go on. Sure.
I'm curious why removing the ability to have collective bargaining over benefits closes the budget gap. They keep saying this is about collective bargaining. How do you respond to that?
Yeah, the bottom line is, and again, as a local government official, I can tell you, you're going to see major cuts in aid to local government, which is exactly what's going to come, what I've said is going to come for some time, and what nearly every other governor across the country is doing. The only way I can ensure to the public in this state that those cuts aren't going to lead to massive layoffs of teachers, city, county, local government workers, major cuts in core services at the local level, is if those local governments have the authority to set their pension and benefit levels the way we're outlining in this bill. If you have collective bargaining agreements in place, there's no guarantee that any of those savings will be materialized.
But you remove future collective bargaining altogether. You give the government the absolute upper hand over them, don't you?
You ultimately allow local and state government to determine what the pension and health care benefits are in the future. Absolutely. That's what local governments have been asking for years. They don't have that. I didn't have that when I was the county executive. That's why time and time again I come back to the unions in Milwaukee County and ask for simple changes in terms of pension or health care contribution. I even asked for a while for a 35-hour work week. Their response to me was, we don't want it. You can go do something else. Go lay off 400 or 500 employees. We don't care. The reality is I think the people of the state care, both because it will affect services negatively and because in this environment, in this economy, I don't think many of us, other than a few of the union leaders, want anybody laid off at a time when the economy is so tough.
Governor, the president has called your bill an assault on unions. Now, there have been reports that the DNC has their campaign arm, Organizing for America, here. What's your response to perhaps this issue here in Wisconsin becoming a 2012 issue for the president?
I think the President of the United States has his hands full balancing the federal budget deficit. They have big problems there. We should stick to balancing the federal budget.
Governor, yesterday you said that you wouldn't be moving your budget address. Today you put a request to move it to March 1st. Why the change?
Simply put, because of what's happened with the 14 members of the State Senate Democratic Caucus. We're not certain exactly when the Senate's going to be able to come back in and take the vote. There's a majority of members who are ready to vote and to vote for that measure, just as there is in December. Unfortunately, the members of the state Senate, who out of those 14, let me remind everybody, 13 of them 2 years ago voted for the budget adjustment bill that raised taxes by $1 billion in this capital. That bill was introduced on Wednesday, it was voted on Thursday. So apparently 2 years ago, 24 hours was time enough to raise taxes on the taxpayers of Wisconsin by $1 billion. Now a week, in an unprecedented amount of 17 hours of public hearing, testimony by the Joint Finance Committee is not long enough. The reality is they're not doing their job. They belong back here just like all of the state workers and county workers and local government workers across the state, who I appreciate went to work today to do their job. The state Senate needs to do their job, and until they do, we're gonna wait because it's imperative we get this done first.
Governor, even if it is absolutely essential for you to take away the collective bargaining rights of every public employee union in the state, how exactly is that a modest request, or as you said, a very modest request?
It's modest in terms of what we're asking for. If you ask the people who are paying 25% or more for their health care.
But that speaks to the benefits question, not the removal of collective bargaining rights.
Well, right. In this state, we have the strongest civil service system in the country. Our rights for our workers are not guaranteed by collective bargaining. They're guaranteed by something that passed more than a century ago, and that is the civil service system in the state, which is the strongest in the country. Civil service protections for state employees include merit hiring and just cause when it comes to discipline and termination. Those rights don't expire when collective bargaining is adjusted as being proposed in this measure. So those rights, and unfortunately, I think a lot of folks outside who are being motivated by the union membership don't fully recognize those rights are not because of collective bargaining, they're because of the civil service system in the state, and it continues. The difference is, for those outside of government, who overwhelmingly are paying more than double what we're asking for in this measure. They look at this and say, where do I sign up for this? This is remarkable. What you're basically asking for is every guy, every factory worker I talked to this last year, who's paying 25 to 50% for the health care premium, who doesn't have a pension, who's got to pay into a 401k, and in some cases had that suspended, every one of them looks at that and says, you know what, not only do I not get that, that guy has to pay for it.
But don't you
that
think
guy has to pay the difference on the fact that while he's not getting even a fraction of what our state and local government employees are getting, he has to pay the bill
Sure.
for everybody else.
But you're focusing resentment on one class of workers against another, aren't you, sir?
Governor, you're on our fourth day here. You and the unions are both making the same pretty impassioned statements that you were making 4 days ago. What's the exit strategy here for our state?
I think ultimately the exit strategy is for the people of the state, particularly in those 14 state Senate districts, who, regardless of how they feel about the bill, I think had an expectation, whether their senator was elected last November or 2 years prior, had a very sincere expectation that the people they sent to serve in the state capitol are people who ultimately will show up and do their job. People talk about democracy. You can't participate in democracy if you're not in the arena. The arena is not in Rockford, Illinois. The arena is in Madison, Wisconsin. And it's time for those state senators to come home. Now, if they want to debate this, if they want to discuss this, if they want to argue the merits of their position, come offer evidence, come offer discussion. But hiding out in another state is not a way for democracy to operate. A handful of people in the minority don't get to drive the majority. They should have every right to be heard, and they would be afforded that opportunity if they show up for work.
What about those constituents that support the walkout, Governor?
What's that?
What about those constituents of those 14 senators that support the walkout?
Well, again, I hope the majority of people in the state, no matter what they think about this bill, ultimately believe that members of the state legislature should be working.
Governor,
We can't operate in a democracy if people don't show up.
Governor,
Nobody's on this group. This is a much longer debate than what we had 2 years ago in the budget adjustment bill. We've afforded unprecedented. I served in the legislature. I don't ever remember a 17-hour hearing. People have heard the testimony. In fact, one of the most remarkable things is since midnight last night, we've got nearly 19,000 emails to this office alone. The majority of those have been people in favor of what we're proposing. So we are certainly bolstered by the fact that while people, when you hear them outside, they have every right to be heard.
Governor,
We're not going to let for 1 minute these voices overshadow and overpower the voices of the taxpayers across the state who elect us to do the job and that meant balancing this budget. That's exactly what we're doing. Thank you.